Alright. Welcome. This is a video for the overview module of Linguistics 101. This video kicks off the content of the course by framing some general concepts. We're first going to define what sort of language we deal with in linguistics and in this course. And then we'll define the term linguistics itself. We'll close by looking at the difference between descriptive and prescriptive approaches to language. So first of all, what is language? Well, linguistics is the study of languages, but before we get into how we as linguists do that, we've got to take a closer look at what we mean by language. The main thing is that it's a form of communication, which is a good start, but there's a lot of things that are different forms of communication. Are they all language? We'll start with verbal communication, spoken language, what I'm producing right now and you're hearing and understanding. This is certainly a form of language. And in fact, it's the center and the foundation of almost all human language. Almost every culture and almost every individual human learns spoken language before any other form of language, and continues using it far more often than any other form. If you can speak, you learn to speak before you can learn to read and write. You speak generally a lot more than you read and write. Although pretty much every culture has a spoken language, not all cultures throughout history or even right now have written language or any other form of language. Okay. Now, a lot of the almosts in that description are because of the second one, which is sign languages. This is a gestural version of language. It's not me waving my hands about. I do that a lot, but I'm not doing sign language. And sign language is also language. It's a full complex language, just as much complexity, expressiveness, and richness as spoken language. And a lot of linguists do study it. It is language as linguists understand it. We don't focus on sign language in this course, but many of the principles that we do cover can be applied equally well to sign languages. Now, what about writing? We experience a lot of writing in the modern world. And it is a really good medium for communicating about language. As linguists, as participants in this course, we're going to be using I have a lot of text out there on the course website. There's a textbook, which is largely written. So yeah, and writing is a form of language, and it is studied by linguists. And although a lot of our content is in writing, we don't specifically analyze writing in this course. A lot of our analysis works equally well for spoken language and written language, but written language isn't the sole focus of any of our analyses. And this is largely because speech and signing, for those who use it, is so much more primary and central to our psychology than writing is. Some linguists actually treat spoken language or sign language and written language as two separate systems. We see a lot of overlap, but they seem to work very differently in a lot of ways in terms of how we process them, how they affect us. Okay. What about gestures? This like hand-wavy stuff that I'm always doing automatically, and a lot of us do. They can seem, especially to those of us who don't know sign languages, to be really similar to sign language, like part of sign language. But in sign language, every individual sign or gesture, whether it's got a hand shape, a position, and a movement. There's lots of signs out there. Gestures, more generally, are more of an arbitrary. It's kind of like punctuation or emphasis to what we're saying, and they carry very little actual formal meaning in the way that the gestures of sign languages do. So gestures are not sign language, but they are a way of communicating. I do use gestures to punctuate or to emphasize things, to help structure my utterances and your perception of my utterances, and even to add a little bit of extra information. I'm talking about her or that, right? the indexical value of gestures can be useful. It is a kind of language, and linguists do study it. We're not going to get that far in this introductory course. Similar to gestures is body language. So not just what I'm doing with my hands, but how I'm adjusting my head and how I'm framing my body, and how I'm sitting, how I'm moving around. That kind of thing carries information. And it's like gesture. It's a kind of gesture for the whole body, right? So it is something that linguists can study, but it's again sort of more towards the periphery. So we're not going to look at that in this class. So let's move a bit further afield. What about the ways that animals communicate with one another? Non-human animals, dogs barking or growling, cats purring and meowing, and birds chirping, and all of that. Now, this is certainly a kind of communication, a way of carrying information from individual to individual, like human language is for the humans that use it. And it turns out, through study by linguists and people in linguistics adjacent fields of biology, that a lot of the properties that are interesting to us in human languages are shared in part by different non-human communication systems. This is sort of branching into some sort of cross-disciplinary stuff, linguist and biologist, linguist and anthropologist, or something like that. But it certainly is a linguistic field of inquiry. We're certainly not going to be studying animal communication in this course. All right, what about computer languages? I mean, they're called languages, right? That's a kind of language, and they're created by humans. But they have a functionally very different purpose. The languages that we're interested in this course are languages where I have a thought and I want to communicate that thought to you, or you have a thought and you want to communicate it to me, right? Between human mind and human mind. A computer language takes a human thought and translates it into something a computer can understand. And that's computers think a lot differently than us, to the extent that we can say they think. Now, the study of computer languages has influenced and informed the study of human languages, and vice versa. Excuse me. The study of human languages has shaped the design of certain computer languages. But the parallels are more formal, as a way of example, rather than these different types of language being really the same phenomenon. So some of linguistic study overlaps with that. We certainly aren't going to be looking at computer languages in this class. What about math? What about art? What about road signs? There's a whole lot of different ways that we communicate with each other, that we set up ways for an idea to be transferred from one person to another, or one institution, or whatever, right? And I certainly encourage you to think about a lot of these parallels. Linguists do look at a lot of different types of communication beyond just spoken language, written language, sign language, these sort of core things that I've mentioned. We're not going to be tackling any of these directly in class. In this course, we're focusing on spoken language, and where possible, we'll connect it to sign languages and written languages, notice parallels, notice differences. And to linguists more generally, any form of communication that communicates or transfers ideas from one person to another person is really of interest to linguists. And we're pretty broad individuals. We're interested in all of these. The only things that might be called communication or transferring information that linguists wouldn't study as linguists would be ways of transferring information that don't involve conscious individuals at all. So, the example I have in the notes, the radiation of light energy from a star carries some information, and you can observe it and measure the spectrum and know about the star, but that's not something a linguist would study. That's not a conscious entity communicating something. It's just a natural phenomenon that happens to contain information, slightly outside of our remit as linguists. Okay, so that's a general framing of what language is. Linguistics is the scientific study of human language, generally human language. Like I said, we do touch on non-human language often to help inform us about human language. But the scientific study of language, let's say. So we've already talked plenty about what we mean by language, but what does it mean to say that it's a scientific study? A lot of people study language in various different ways. For a field of study to be scientific, we have to be looking to discover things, describe things, explain aspects of the phenomenon that we're investigating. So we'll get to discovering and explaining later on. But that describe, that's a much more important word than it might seem at first. There's more going on than you might think. So describing isn't just about coming up with claims, this is a fact about language and that's a fact about language. These claims have to have a certain flavor to them, a certain character, a certain attitude, you might say. Specifically, that attitude has to set value judgments aside. Now, of course, there are values in science. Science, like in terms of objectivity, replicability, and there's a variety of values that are held in common by all of the physical and social sciences. But the kind of value judgments I'm talking about here are, this is a good kind of language and that's a bad kind of language. This is good usage and that's bad usage. We should do this, we should not do that when we're producing language or when we're describing language. Those are value judgments, talking about good and bad, better, worse, should not. And that's a prescriptive approach, and it's useful. It's useful when you're trying to learn how can I produce an essay that's going to get recognized as worthy of getting the mark in this English class. How do I produce a poem that conforms to a particular form, a sonnet or a limerick or whatever it is? You need a prescriptive attitude. This is what you should do, this is what you should not do in order to accomplish that goal. But as scientists studying language, that prescriptive attitude is not helpful, right? I need to be able to describe as a linguist what someone's doing when they use non-standard forms, slang, or non-standard regional forms, right? And if I start saying, well, this isn't a great way to use language, that interferes with my ability to do that, okay? And there are examples in the notes of how this works. And it can be tough because a lot of the ways that we think consciously about language growing up are through our schooling, where often what we're after is a prescriptive approach to what's going on in language. This is something you should do. This is something you should avoid doing. And like I said, that can be useful in certain contexts. But when we're doing linguistics, we want to talk about language descriptively. What is happening? Just like an astrophysicist might have a favorite type of star. A red dwarf. Red dwarfs are cool stars. They live forever. Not forever, but for a much longer time than other types of stars. But when you're doing astrophysics, you can't be injecting your preference for red dwarfs into how you interpret the data, right? It might drive what kinds of questions you want to ask, but the way that you answer them shouldn't be some prescriptivism, meta-prescriptive. You shouldn't be injecting your preferences into how you're analyzing the phenomenon, and the same thing happens for language. As linguists, there are things that bug me to no end, the way that people use language, and that's fine. But when I'm doing linguistics, I can't use that negative attitude as part of my analysis or part of my description. It would make an inappropriate linguistic paper. And so I think that's good for this video. We've introduced the approach to language that we're going to be taking in this course. You should have an idea of how linguists define language, what kinds of language we're interested in, and the attitude we use when we approach our analysis of language. Okay? So, let's get your analytical mind working. So let's see if you can answer the following question. Is music a type of language, as we've defined here? Would linguists study music? And, I mean, you can look it up online, but just try to think about it in terms of what you've learned in this video first. And think of 2 reasons to justify your answer. Yes, music is a kind of language. No, it isn't. And, if you think that some kinds of music are, some aren't, that's fine too. And now what about a follow-up question? And this should work whether you answered yes or no to the first question. How could one approach music descriptively? And how could one approach music prescriptively? Now we're going to discuss these answers together in the class, so have your answers ready. Think about that. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.